History often turns on moments no one could have predicted. A single alliance, a single decision, or even a single cannon blast can shape the destiny of nations. In the autumn of 1781, on a quiet peninsula in Virginia, one such moment unfolded. The might of the British Empire faced a force it never truly understood, a force that would not only crush its red-coated legions, but also give birth to a new nation. This is the untold story of Yorktown, the final stand of the British Army, and the secret weapon that sealed America's independence. Picture yourself on a battlefield in October 1781. The ground quivers beneath your boots, the air thick with acrid smoke and burning powder. All around you, ranks of soldiers stand ready, their faces grim with exhaustion and determination. Yet this battle is unlike any before. There's something here the British never anticipated, something that would alter the course of history forever. Most people remember Yorktown as the climactic battle of the American Revolution. But few know why Britain's seemingly unstoppable army, the most feared military power on earth, fell so completely. Their defeat wasn't only a matter of strategy or valor. It came down to one decisive element, an unexpected force that caught them utterly unprepared. To uncover what that secret weapon was, we must first step back and see the war as it stood. By 1781, the American struggle for independence had dragged on for 6 punishing years. The colonists were locked in a David and Goliath fight against the British Empire, whose reach spanned continents and oceans. The Redcoats, named for their bright crimson uniforms, were elite, disciplined, and armed with the best weapons of the age. Their generals were schooled in Europe's most prestigious academies. Their fleet ruled the seas. The Americans were something else entirely: farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and students who had laid down their plows to take up muskets. Their army was a patchwork of local militias and volunteers with mismatched clothing and weapons, often better suited for hunting than war. Most had never faced professional soldiers before. The early years of the conflict were brutal, defeat after defeat. New York lost, Philadelphia occupied. The rebellion seemed doomed to collapse. Then in 1778, the balance shifted. France, still burning with humiliation from its loss to Britain in the 7 Years' War, decided to strike back by aiding the Americans. The alliance was a turning point. France sent troops, muskets, and supplies, yes, but their true gift was something far more potent: overwhelming naval power. This would become the weapon that turned the tide. By the summer of 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis was leading his weary but confident army through the Carolinas and into Virginia. Ordered to establish a base along the coast, he selected the small port of Yorktown, nestled between the York and James rivers. There, he built formidable defenses, redoubts, trenches, and ramparts, convinced he could hold out indefinitely. After all, the Americans had no navy to cut him off. Even a siege would mean little. The British fleet could always bring reinforcements or evacuate his men by sea. But Cornwallis didn't know what was coming. General George Washington camped near New York, and the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, were secretly preparing an audacious plan, one that would depend on flawless coordination between land and sea, perfect timing across hundreds of miles, and an almost impossible level of secrecy. Washington had long been planning an assault on New York, but when word arrived that Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse was sailing from the Caribbean with a massive French fleet, everything changed. De Grasse commanded 28 ships of the line, colossal warships bristling with 60 to 80 cannons apiece. They were floating fortresses, the most formidable machines of destruction on the planet. And de Grasse wasn't sailing for New York. He was heading straight for the Chesapeake Bay, where Cornwallis was entrenching himself. The British had no idea that their greatest strength, command of the sea, was about to vanish. That was the secret weapon, not a new invention, not some experimental tactic, but the overwhelming naval might of France. Control of the sea, the power to cut Cornwallis off from escape or supply, to turn Yorktown from a fortress into a trap. But the plan hinged on one enormous gamble. Washington had to move his army all the way from New York to Virginia, nearly 400 miles, without the British realizing his true destination. If they caught wind of the scheme, they could strike his forces on the march or evacuate Cornwallis before the trap was sprung. So Washington turned to deception. He faked preparations for an assault on New York, building bread ovens, scouting fortifications, even feeding false intelligence to British spies. Meanwhile, under cover of secrecy, his troops began their long march south. In August 1781, Washington and Rochambeau led their combined armies, over 12,000 men, through towns and forests, across rivers and mountain passes. It was one of the most extraordinary logistical feats of the war. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of wagons, artillery pieces, and supplies moved with precision across hostile territory, all while maintaining the illusion of another campaign entirely. By the time the British in New York realized the truth, Washington was already halfway to Virginia, and the French fleet had arrived in the Chesapeake. On September 5, 1781, the British Navy under Admiral Thomas Graves sailed into the bay, expecting to find open waters. Instead, they were met by de Grasse's towering warships. The ensuing Battle of the Chesapeake, or the Battle of the Virginia Capes, was a thunderous clash of cannon fire and smoke. For hours, the sea boiled with destruction, until the battered British fleet finally withdrew. Strategically, it was decisive. The French now commanded the bay. Cornwallis was cut off, surrounded by land and sea alike. Trapped in Yorktown with only 7,000 men, Cornwallis faced Washington's and Rochambeau's combined force of over 16,000. The siege began in late September. Trenches snaked through the fields, cannon positions rose by the day, and the noose tightened. Yet it wasn't just the French Navy that sealed Cornwallis's fate. The other half of the French secret weapon came ashore, their engineers and artillerymen. The French possessed the finest artillery in Europe, forged with superior craftsmanship and manned by experts trained through generations of continental warfare. Their cannons were masterpieces, firing 8-, 12-, and 24-pound iron balls capable of pulverizing fortifications and shattering enemy morale. The Siege of Yorktown became a contest of artillery, precision, endurance, and skill. On the night of October 6th, Allied troops dug the first siege trench under cover of darkness. By dawn, a line over 3,000 meters long faced the British defenses. 3 days later, the guns opened fire. Washington himself ignited the first cannon. Its shot ripped through the air and struck a table where British officers were dining, killing one instantly. The bombardment had begun. 50 Allied guns roared in unison. The earth trembled. The night sky glowed red. The French gunners fired with uncanny accuracy, their volleys unrelenting. British positions crumbled under the constant rain of iron and fire. Their return fire dwindled, their cannons failing under strain, their trenches filled with casualties. Over the next several days, Washington and Rochambeau ordered a second, closer siege line, but to complete it, they would have to capture two outer British redoubts, number 9 and number 10. And for that, there would be no more trenches, no more patience, only blood, courage, and a final assault that would decide the fate of empires. The night of October 14th, 1781, the moment that would decide the fate of empires. The siege had dragged on for days. The British defenses were crumbling, their men exhausted, their guns silenced. But two small British outposts still stood, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, stubborn teeth jutting out from Cornwallis's fortress. Washington knew to crush them was to end the war. That evening, under a pale moon and thick clouds of gun smoke, Washington gave the order. Two simultaneous assaults, swift, silent, and merciless. The Americans would strike Redoubt 10, led by a young, ambitious officer named Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, the same man who would one day shape the nation's economy. The French, under the gallant Baron de Villaminel, would storm Redoubt 9. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and courage. No musket fire unless necessary, only bayonets and raw determination. At 8 o'clock, the signal was given. Hamilton's men surged forward through the darkness. The British sentries spotted movement and unleashed musket fire, but the Americans were already upon them. With ladders and axes, they clawed their way up the palisades. The night erupted into chaos, shouts, steel, and blood. Men fought hand to hand, their bayonets flashing like lightning in the dim light. Within minutes, Hamilton's troops overwhelmed the defenders and seized the position. Meanwhile, the French advanced with methodical precision toward Redoubt 9. Their discipline was unshakable. Their ranks moved like a living machine. The British fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In less than 30 minutes, both redoubts had fallen. The path to Yorktown's heart was open. The victory was devastating for Cornwallis. With the redoubts captured, Washington's engineers could finish the second siege line, placing Allied artillery so close to the British defenses that survival became impossible. Inside Yorktown, Cornwallis faced an agonizing truth. His army was trapped. Every escape route, by land or by sea, was sealed. He weighed his dwindling options. A breakout across land? Impossible. The Allied army completely surrounded him. A retreat by sea? Equally hopeless. The French fleet dominated the bay. The few British vessels left were shattered or grounded. Still, in a final act of desperation, Cornwallis attempted the impossible. On the stormy night of October 16th, he ordered his men to cross the York River, hoping to escape northward and link up with British forces elsewhere. At first, the operation seemed to work. The first wave of boats made it across. But then nature struck. A sudden, violent storm descended, whipping up massive waves and tearing the fragile boats apart. The wind howled, rain lashed the shore, and the river turned to chaos. The men who had crossed were stranded on the far bank, cut off from their comrades. By morning, under enemy cannon fire, they had no choice but to return. The escape attempt was over. So was the war. Cornwallis's defenses were rubble, his cannon silent, his soldiers hungry, sick, and beaten. The air reeked of smoke and disease. As the relentless Allied bombardment grew louder each hour, even the most loyal officers knew the truth: Yorktown could not hold. On the morning of October 17th, 4 years to the day after the American triumph at Saratoga, a solitary figure emerged from the British lines. A drummer boy climbed the shattered rampart and began to beat the call to parley, the sound of surrender. At first, the thunder of cannons drowned it out, but slowly, one by one, the Allied guns fell silent. A British officer appeared with a white flag, carrying Cornwallis's letter to Washington, a plea for a ceasefire in terms of surrender. Washington allowed only 2 hours for Cornwallis to submit his proposals. Letters passed back and forth through the night, until finally, on October 18th, representatives from both sides met at the modest Moore House, one of the few buildings still standing. There, they hammered out the terms of capitulation. Washington, though firm, remained fair. The British would surrender their weapons and become prisoners of war. Their officers could retain their swords, symbols of honor, and the soldiers their personal belongings. But there was one condition that struck deep. The British were forbidden to march with their flags flying or to play their national music. This was deliberate, a reversal of the humiliation the Americans had endured when Charleston fell the year before. On October 19, 1781, under a clear Virginia sky, the ceremony began. 2 grand lines stretched for more than a kilometer, Americans on one side, French on the other. Between them marched the defeated British army. But Cornwallis himself, claiming illness, stayed away. He sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to perform the bitter duty. O'Hara approached first the French commander, Rochambeau, perhaps hoping for leniency. Rochambeau, with quiet dignity, pointed toward Washington. O'Hara, turned to the American commander, but Washington, following protocol, directed him to General Benjamin Lincoln, his own second-in-command. Lincoln accepted the sword of surrender, a symbol that the balance of power had truly shifted. The British soldiers marched forward, stacking their muskets in silence. Some wept openly. Others broke their weapons rather than yield them whole. Their band played a melancholy tune, the world turned upside down. And indeed it had. The greatest empire on earth had been defeated by farmers, merchants, and dreamers, a new nation born from defiance and alliance. Over 7,000 British troops laid down their arms. The Allies captured hundreds of cannons, thousands of muskets, and vast stores of supplies. But the real victory was not measured in numbers. It was the shockwave that rippled across the world. When the news reached London, Prime Minister Lord North reportedly gasped, "Oh God, it's all over." And he was right. Though 2 more years would pass before the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war, Yorktown was the point of no return. The British would never again mount a major campaign in America. The secret weapon that made Yorktown possible wasn't a single tool or invention. It was a fusion of power, science, and unity. French naval supremacy sealed off escape. French artillery and engineering shattered British fortifications. And above all, the Franco-American alliance, an improbable partnership born of both idealism and revenge, proved that even empires could bleed. The French brought more than cannons. They brought knowledge. Their artillery schools, their engineers, and their scientific approach to warfare set a new standard. They calculated trajectories with mathematics, crafted cannon barrels with precision metallurgy, and trained gunners to perfection. American officers watched and learned. Among them, Hamilton, who had led the bayonet charge on Redoubt 10, would later champion the creation of a national military academy, the seed that would grow into West Point. Washington himself, shaped by the ordeal of Yorktown, began to advocate for a small but professional standing army, understanding now that freedom required discipline as much as passion. The Siege of Yorktown also revealed a hard truth about modern war, that victory depended as much on logistics and coordination as on bravery. Moving 16,000 troops, heavy guns, and endless supplies across hundreds of miles was a masterpiece of organization, one that reflected the European mastery of siege warfare, but carried out with American resolve. The French artillery of 1781 represented the cutting edge of technology. Bronze and iron cannons, expertly cast, their calibers matched with precision to solid or explosive rounds. Their mortars hurled shells in graceful arcs over enemy walls, guided by complex tables of range, wind, and powder weight, the mathematics of destruction. The explosions they unleashed were not just powerful but psychological. British troops described nights when the very earth seemed to tremble, when sleep became impossible, when the whistling of incoming shells frayed every nerve. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion tore through the British ranks. Dysentery spread in the polluted water. The dead lay unburied under constant fire. Soldiers huddled in muddy trenches, listening to the thunder of French guns they could never silence. They knew the truth. They were beaten not only by men, but by mastery. The French gunners' skill bordered on art. They shifted between ammunition types with precision, solid shot for walls, canister for men, incendiary round for terror. Their timing, communication, and discipline were flawless. The Allied batteries worked in harmony, concentrating fire where it mattered most. Every cannonball, every mortar shell was part of a symphony of calculated devastation. And when the final gun fell silent, it was not merely the end of a siege. It was the dawn of a new world, the alliance of reason and revolution, of Europe's old knowledge and America's new hope had rewritten history. Yorktown was not just a victory. It was a statement. That tyranny, no matter how vast, can be broken by courage. That freedom, once ignited, can never again be contained. As the guns fell silent and smoke drifted across the ruins of Yorktown, The battlefield told its own story, one not only of victory, but of genius, unity, and sacrifice. Behind every cannon blast and trench line was another army. The engineers, the thinkers, the craftsmen who built the road to triumph with shovels, geometry, and sheer endurance. Among all the forces that shaped the outcome at Yorktown, few were as decisive as the French engineers. They were the quiet architects of victory, the men who transformed muddy fields into machines of war. Every trench, battery, and rampart was the product of their discipline and expertise. They understood how to bend the landscape itself into a weapon, how to turn earth, timber, and sweat into protection and firepower. The engineers knew the art of siege warfare as few others did. They measured the soil, the slope, the wind. Trenches had to be deep enough to shelter men from musket fire, but not so deep that rain turned them into graves. They had to be wide enough for wagons and artillery, yet narrow enough to dig quickly under fire. The layout was a masterpiece of geometry, zigzagging lines that denied the enemy a clear shot, cross-covering batteries that could protect each other, and communication trenches that allowed troops and supplies to flow like blood through the arteries of the army. Thousands of soldiers labored under moonlight, shovels clinking against the stony earth, sweat mixing with gunpowder. British cannon fire rained down, but the work never stopped. The French engineers led the way with centuries of hard-won knowledge, using techniques refined across Europe's wars. They advanced their trenches under fire with a method known as sapping, pushing forward behind great wicker baskets filled with earth called gabions. Slowly, carefully, they crept closer, always shielded, always calculating. They reinforced their works with fascines, thick bundles of branches bound together to stabilize the walls, and sausages of woven wood packed with soil to absorb musket fire. It was slow, brutal, methodical, but unstoppable. Without these engineers, the siege could not have succeeded. Without the French Navy, Cornwallis could have escaped. Without the French artillery, his walls might have held. And without French soldiers, Washington's army would never have been large enough to surround Yorktown completely. Yet the victory was not French alone. The Americans fought with the fire of conviction. Hamilton's bold charge on Redoubt 10, executed with precision and fury, remains one of the most daring assaults in Revolutionary history. Washington's leadership held everything together: the alliance, the logistics, the morale. He was not just a commander. He was the bridge between two worlds, the new and the old, keeping French discipline and American defiance in perfect balance. The Franco-American alliance was a miracle of cooperation. There were differences of language, of culture, of military tradition. The French were masters of order and formality. The Americans were flexible, improvisational, unpredictable. Misunderstandings arose. Tempers sometimes flared, but the cause united them. Rochambeau, the French commander, deserves immense credit. He was older, more experienced, and commanded veteran troops. Yet he never tried to overshadow Washington. He understood that the war's political and symbolic heart belonged to the Americans, and he gave Washington the respect and authority needed to keep the alliance strong. His quiet diplomacy was as vital as his tactics. And then there was Admiral de Grasse, the man who changed everything. His decision to sail his fleet not to New York, but to the Chesapeake Bay, sealed Cornwallis's fate. His ships carried troops, ammunition, and supplies. His cannons thundered over the bay, and his victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake ensured that no British ship would ever reach Yorktown. He risked his entire fleet to trap the enemy, and succeeded. Looking back, it's astonishing how much depended on chance, how thin the line between victory and disaster truly was. Had de Grasse arrived days later, Cornwallis might have escaped. Had the storm not shattered his attempted crossing of the York River, the war could have dragged on for years. Had the British in New York discovered Washington's deception sooner, they might have crushed the Continental Army before it reached Virginia. History often pivots on such fragile hinges: a delayed messenger, a sudden gust of wind, a single decision made in doubt. At Yorktown, every thread wove together perfectly, creating a moment that reshaped the world. The consequences of Yorktown stretched far beyond Virginia's shores. For America, it marked the birth of a new nation, one founded not by kings, but by ideas. In the years that followed, those ideals were etched into the Constitution, a document that would become the blueprint for democracies around the globe. The words liberty and equality, once whispered in rebellion, would echo across continents. For France, Yorktown's victory came at a heavy price. The immense cost of supporting the American cause deepened the kingdom's financial crisis, a burden that helped ignite the French Revolution. French soldiers returned home, carrying more than scars. They carried ideas. They had fought for freedom abroad and would soon demand it for themselves. For Britain, Yorktown was a humiliation, but not an ending. The empire survived, stronger in other corners of the world. Yet the lesson was clear: military might could not hold colonies whose hearts burned for independence. In the decades to come, Britain's policies grew more measured, its grip more pragmatic. The empire had learned, painfully, that power without understanding leads to loss. Yorktown also stood as a monument to progress, the moment where science and warfare intertwined like never before. The French artillery was the most advanced in the world: bronze and iron cannons cast with mathematical precision, mortars calibrated for parabolic fire, powder charges measured to fractions. Their gunners considered every variable: wind, humidity, temperature, trajectory. War was becoming not just an act of courage, but an act of calculation. The siege proved that artillery could decide wars, and armies across the globe took note. Military academies expanded their studies of geometry and physics. Engineers became as vital as generals. From Yorktown's lessons would grow the industrialized warfare of the 19th century, a new era where science would rule the battlefield. Equally revolutionary was the recognition of naval power. The French fleet's triumph at Chesapeake became a case study in the decisive role of sea control. In America, debates soon began about whether the young nation needed a navy of its own. That debate led to the creation of the United States Navy, destined to become the world's most powerful maritime force. Perhaps the greatest innovation, however, was not material but organizational: the seamless cooperation between land and sea. Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse achieved what few commanders before them had: perfect synchronization. Their coordination became the foundation for modern joint operations, studied by military strategists even today. But beyond the tactics, beyond the brilliance of artillery and the thunder of fleets, Yorktown holds a deeper truth, one that transcends armies and centuries. It is the story of perseverance. For 6 long years, the Americans had faced starvation, defeat, and despair. They had lost cities, homes, and loved ones. Yet they refused to yield. George Washington personified that endurance. Through every freezing winter, every retreat, every impossible decision, he carried the burden of a cause larger than himself. And at Yorktown, that unbreakable resolve was finally rewarded. Because in the end, Yorktown was never just about weapons or strategy, it was about belief. The soldiers who fought there did so not for gold or conquest, but for ideals: liberty, equality, the right to shape one's destiny. They faced the greatest empire on earth and proved that freedom cannot be subdued by force. The British learned that truth in the ashes of Yorktown. They discovered that you can conquer land, but not conviction, that the will of a free people is stronger than any cannon. And so, as we look back across 2 centuries, the secret weapon that destroyed the Redcoats at Yorktown reveals itself in full. It was not merely the French Navy or their superior artillery. It was not even the genius of Washington or the precision of Rochambeau. It was the alliance of hearts and minds, the fusion of courage, knowledge, and faith in something greater than victory itself. It was the belief that a better world could be built and the determination to make it real. That was the true power that thundered across Yorktown. And it is the same power that continues to shape the world today.